A young mom went out for her usual morning run, but never made it back home. Police quickly launched a massive search, and within hours, they uncovered a string of disturbing clues. But what started as a local investigation soon made headlines across the country, because no one was prepared for what this case would turn into. Eliza Fletcher was born on November 9, 1987 in Memphis, Tennessee. Her family was well known in the area. Her grandfather owned a private hardware supply company worth over $3 billion. They were known not just for their money, but for giving back, always supporting local charities and making a real impact in the community. Even though Eliza was set to inherit the family business someday, she had other plans. She wanted to be a teacher. She finished a private high school, went on to the University of Memphis, and eventually got her master's in education. And she wasn't just book smart. Eliza was also a gifted athlete. She played on her university soccer team, loved running, and took part in marathons whenever she could. Once she graduated, she got a job as a preschool teacher, and from day one it was clear she was made for it. Eliza had a natural connection with kids, and they absolutely adored her. She was also deeply involved in her church. During one of the services, she met a man named Richard. The two began dating, eventually got married, and went on to have 2 sons together. Ever since then, Eliza had been focused on raising her kids and doing the job she loved at the preschool. She and her husband were also big fans of the outdoors. Any chance they got, they'd head out on a hike, go camping, or take off on a road trip with the family. Eliza also stayed super dedicated to her fitness routine. She went for a run almost every single morning, and true crime podcasts were always playing in our earbuds. She pretty much never hit the pavement without one. In 2022, when she was 34, Eliza was in the middle of training for the Boston Marathon. She'd been running even more than usual, and to fit it all in, she started going out around 4 a.m. That way, she could get her run in and still be home in time to have breakfast with her family before heading to work. On the morning of September 2nd, Eliza got up before sunrise and headed out for her usual run. She lived near the University of Memphis and loved running along the campus. Her typical route was about 4 miles out and back, roughly an hour round trip. But that morning, something fell off. When her husband woke up and realized Eliza still wasn't home, he texted her a few times. Got no reply. Then he started calling, but she didn't pick up. That was completely out of character for Eliza. She was supposed to work the early shift that day, and she took her job very seriously. So, Richard decided not to wait any longer and called the police around 7 a.m. Detectives jumped into action right away. Based on what they knew at that point, it didn't look like Eliza had just gone off somewhere on her own. According to her husband, she only took a water bottle and her phone with her, so it wasn't like she had plans to go anywhere after the run. Since Eliza usually ran near the university, police reached out to the school's administration and asked them to alert students, just in case there was someone dangerous in the area. Given how well-known Eliza's family was in Memphis, news of her disappearance spread fast. Local media jumped on the story almost immediately, and within hours, theories started circulating around the city. One of the most common was that her husband might have been involved, since in cases like this, the spouse is often the first person people look at. Viewers watched his interviews closely, trying to figure out if there was something off about his behavior. But from the very beginning, police had no reason to suspect Richard. Everything pointed to him being at home when Eliza left for her run. Officers were sent out to canvass the area, while detectives started collecting surveillance footage along Eliza's usual route. And pretty soon, they spotted her. Running just like always, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then they got to one particular camera, positioned just a short distance from the university, and what they saw was chilling. At 4:20 a.m., Eliza ran past a parked SUV. A few seconds later, a man jumped out and ran after her. There was a brief struggle, and then he forced her into the vehicle. The car stayed there for another 4 minutes before driving off with Eliza inside. Now that investigators knew they were dealing with a kidnapping, the case kicked into high gear. More resources were brought in, and the priority was clear. Find Eliza alive. The suspect had been caught on camera, but the footage was grainy and didn't give them much to work with. Same with the license plate. It was too blurry to read. Still, detectives did notice something interesting. Reviewing footage from other cameras, they saw the same SUV drive past Eliza just minutes before the abduction. Even earlier, about 20 minutes before it happened, the car had been circling the area near the university. It looked like the driver was deliberately hunting for someone. Once he spotted Eliza, he parked up ahead and waited for her to run past. Police shared the footage with local media, hoping someone might recognize the man. They also managed to identify the make and model of the SUV and noted that it had a busted taillight. But even with that detail, tracking the suspect down wasn't going to be easy. Meanwhile, police got a new lead. That same morning, someone had found a water bottle and a cell phone lying by the side of the road, roughly 7 miles from where Eliza was taken. The person handed them over to police, but it took a few hours to confirm they were connected to her disappearance. With help from her family, detectives verified that the phone belonged to Eliza. It looked like the kidnapper had tossed it out the window while driving. But that wasn't all. Right next to the phone and bottle, investigators found something else. A pair of men's flip-flops. Police were almost certain they'd been dumped along with the other items, which was odd. Why would the suspect throw away his own footwear? One theory was that the sandals might have been stained with blood, and he was trying to get rid of the evidence. But that also meant one thing. If he'd been wearing them barefoot, they could contain traces of his DNA. The flip-flops were rushed to the lab for testing while officers kept combing the area. Thanks to this discovery, detectives had a better idea of the route the suspect might have taken and focused their search along that path. But it didn't lead anywhere. That went on for several more hours until detectives finally got a call from the lab. Forensic experts had managed to pull a DNA profile of the flip-flops, and it came back with a hit in the FBI's database. The sample matched a 38-year-old man named Cleotha Abstin. As you might have guessed, the fact that his DNA was in the system meant he had some serious criminal record, but more on that in a bit. For now, detectives had a name, and they immediately shifted focus to tracking him down. The next day, Saturday, officers spotted Cleotha's car on the road. He tried to get away and even managed to lose them for a short time, running into an apartment where his brother lived. But police quickly caught up with him and Cleotha was taken into custody. Cleotha was brought in for questioning right away, but he denied everything. He claimed he had nothing to do with the abduction and said he didn't even understand why he'd been arrested. While detectives kept trying to get him to talk, officers spoke with his brother, and what he shared raised a few eyebrows. He said that on the morning of the abduction, Cleotha had come over, tossed some clothes into the laundry, and started scrubbing down his car like his life depended on it, which was pretty weird. Detectives got a warrant to search both Cleotha's car and his brother's apartment, hoping to uncover something useful. The apartment didn't turn up anything related to the case, but police did arrest the brother anyway after finding illegal weapons and drugs inside. As for the car, forensic techs found traces of blood, and testing confirmed it belonged to Eliza. But even then, Cleotha stuck to his story. He kept claiming he was innocent and refused to say what had happened to her. So once again, detectives were left with more questions than answers. They still held out hope that Eliza might be found alive. But with each passing hour, that hope was slipping further and further away. The search continued through Monday until later that evening when detectives got a call from one of the search teams. A woman's body had been found in a patch of tall grass on an abandoned property just a few hundred yards from where Eliza's phone had been recovered. Investigators were almost certain it was her, but they had to wait until the next day for official confirmation before making an announcement. The medical examiner later confirmed that the victim had multiple scrapes and abrasions and the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. Her shorts were missing when the body was found, though police later discovered them in a nearby trash bin. Still, investigators didn't publicly confirm whether there had been a sexual assault. Even though Cleotha continued to deny everything, the evidence was overwhelming and eventually he was officially charged with first-degree murder. Given how closely the public had followed the case and how widely it was covered in the media, the confirmation of Eliza's death sparked a wave of anger and heartbreak across Memphis. But what came next turned that outrage into full-on fury. Because details of Cleotha's criminal past had just come to light. He first came to the attention of police when he was just 11 years old. That's when he was sent to juvenile detention for robbery. But that was only the beginning. Between the ages of 11 and 16, Cleotha was arrested 16 more times for everything from petty theft to illegal gun possession, assault, and gang activity. At 16, he ended up behind bars again, this time for sexually assaulting a man. He served 6 months in juvenile detention, then was released into his mother's custody. But just 2 weeks later, he was arrested yet again. That time, he kidnapped a well-known attorney at gunpoint. He forced the man into his car and drove around looking for an ATM. When he took him out to withdraw money, the attorney started yelling for help, and Cleotha was arrested. Even though he was just 16, the court tried him as an adult and sentenced him to 24 years in prison. He served 20 of those years before being granted early release in November 2020, and that meant if he'd served his full sentence, he never would have had the chance to go after Eliza, or anyone else. When Cleotha's case hit the news, a woman named Alicia came forward, and what she revealed sparked a massive outrage at law enforcement. She said she met Cleotha in the summer of 2021 through a dating app, and after a few weeks of chatting, he asked her out. That night, he told her to pick him up and gave her an address. When she arrived, Cleotha invited her to come inside. But the moment Alicia stepped into the building, she realized something was off. The place was completely abandoned. There was no way he actually lived there. And later, it turned out this was the same abandoned property where Eliza's body would be found. Once they were inside, Cleotha pulled a gun and forced Alicia back into her car, where he sexually assaulted her. At the time, she was 4 months pregnant, and she told him that, hoping that it might stop him. But it didn't. After the assault, Cleotha walked away, and Alicia drove herself to the hospital and reported everything to the police. Forensics collected DNA evidence, and she gave investigators his dating profile, which included his name, photo, and phone number. At this point, you're probably asking the obvious question. If this assault happened over a year before Eliza's abduction and police had everything they needed to arrest Cleotha, then why was he still walking free? The answer was as simple as it was infuriating. Police just didn't get around to finishing the case. Even though they had his DNA, his name, photo, and phone number, they didn't file the report in time. In fact, the DNA sample they collected from Alicia's case wasn't even uploaded to the FBI's database until after Eliza was murdered. When public outrage exploded, the police department responded by saying they were simply short-staffed, so they just never got to it. So really, the system failed Eliza not once, but twice. First, by letting Cleotha out of prison 4 years early, and second, by ignoring a case that could have put him back behind bars long before he had the chance to hurt anyone else. Desperate for justice, Alicia had even filed a lawsuit against the city, but it was thrown out. Only after Eliza's murder did Cleotha finally face charges for this crime. But by that point, none of it really mattered because Cleotha was already behind bars and prosecutors had made it clear they'd be seeking the death penalty. Still, Cleotha continued to deny everything, and surprisingly, his entire family stood by him. His mother even told reporters that she believed her son was innocent because he told her he didn't kill anyone. She also described him as a kind and good-hearted person. But the truth was, Eliza wasn't even his last victim. Just 1 day before her murder, Cleotha, who worked for a cleaning service, showed up for a shift at a movie theater. That evening, another employee realized 2 of her credit cards were missing, and someone had already started using them. When she checked the surveillance footage, she saw Cleotha stealing her cards. And here's the detail that really stood out. On that footage, he was wearing the same sandals he later ditched alongside Eliza's phone and water bottle. Unfortunately, the woman didn't get the chance to report the theft in time, so those charges were only added to his growing list after Eliza was murdered. In the end, Cleotha was sent to prison to await multiple trials. The first was for the assault on Alicia, and in May 2024, he was sentenced to 80 years behind bars. Then came the trial for Eliza's murder. Prosecutors were still pushing for the death penalty. But eventually, Cleotha was offered a plea deal, plead guilty in exchange for life in prison with no chance of parole. After some consideration, he took the deal, and in October 2024, he was officially sentenced, guaranteeing he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. So yes, he avoided execution, but at least now, he'll never have another chance to hurt anyone again. This case ended up being yet another example of how the justice system, through early release and years of inaction, allowed a violent man to walk free and keep committing crimes, even though there were plenty of red flags that should have kept him behind bars. In Eliza's memory, thousands of people came together to run the same route where she was taken, finishing the run she never got to complete. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button. A young woman from France set off to visit her relatives in Britain for Christmas, but along the way, she vanished without a trace. Police immediately launched a large-scale search, and the case quickly made headlines in both countries. Before long, investigators pieced together a chain of clues that brought them closer to the truth. But what they uncovered was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Céline Fegard was born on May 23, 1976, in the French town of Besançon. It was a quiet and peaceful place, not far from the Swiss border. Céline grew up in a loving family with her parents, 2 brothers, and a sister. Her dad was a farmer, so she and her siblings spent a lot of time outside, helping him keep the farm running. At school, Céline was active in sports and had many friends. When she was 14, her parents took her to nearby Britain and she absolutely loved it. From that point on, she started thinking about moving there someday. She decided to pursue an education that would allow her to work in the hotel business, inspired by her cousin, who was a hotel manager in the UK. After finishing school, Céline enrolled in a local university to study accounting. She also continued visiting her cousin in England whenever she could. One summer, he helped her get a job at a hotel, and she spent a few months working there before returning home. At the end of 1995, when Céline was 19, she decided to travel to Britain again for Christmas. At that time of year, public trains in France were experiencing disruptions, so her parents asked a family friend, a truck driver, for help. He was delivering cargo to England and agreed to give her a ride to a town called Folkestone. From there, Céline planned to travel to Fordingbridge, a town about 150 miles or 250 kilometers away, where her cousin lived. On December 18th, Céline left home, planning to reach her cousin's hotel by that evening. Her parents were expecting a call from her to let them know she had arrived safely. But as the evening stretched on, there was no word from Céline. She didn't have a mobile phone, so all her family could do was just wait and hope she would make it to the hotel eventually. Later that night, they finally got a call, but it wasn't Céline. It was her cousin. He told them she still hadn't arrived and asked if something had changed in her plans. Céline's parents grew even more worried and, with no other options, decided to contact the police. French authorities quickly reached out to their British colleagues, who immediately launched a search for the missing woman. Their first step was to speak with Céline's parents, who traveled to England to assist in the investigation. They told them about a family friend, a truck driver, who had agreed to give Céline a ride to Britain. The police tracked him down, and he confirmed that he had dropped her off in Folkestone. After that, he had to head in a different direction. While they were at the truck stop, the driver met another French trucker who was heading to a town called Newbury, about an hour's drive from Céline's cousin's hotel. This second driver agreed to give Céline a lift, and investigators managed to locate him as well. He told the police he had dropped Céline off at a truck stop in Newbury. She had tried using a payphone there to call her cousin and ask him to pick her up, but for some reason, she couldn't get through. By that time, it was already 4:30 p.m. The driver told Céline she could take a train to her cousin's town, but there was a problem. The nearest station was a few dozen miles away, and he couldn't take her there since he had to deliver his cargo in a different direction. He still wanted to help, so he started asking other truckers in the parking lot if anyone could give Céline a ride. The first driver he asked turned him down, saying he was planning to rest before his next trip. But the second trucker agreed. He said he was heading to Salisbury, just about a 30-minute drive from Céline's cousin's town. He even mentioned she could probably catch an 8 p.m. bus from there. With no other options left, Céline went with the third driver, and that's where her trail disappeared. Detectives tried to track this man down, but they didn't have enough solid information to identify him. The second driver, who had handed her over, couldn't recall the license plate number and only remembered that the truck was a white Mercedes. He also provided a description of the man. He was around 35 years old, had short blonde hair and a beard. The second driver also mentioned that something about this man struck him as suspicious. There was something unsettling about his behavior, but he still let Celine go with him because, at that point, she simply had no other choice. Police began to suspect that the third driver might have been involved in Celine's disappearance. Using the witness's description, they created a composite sketch and shared it with the local media. As for the first two drivers, investigators thoroughly checked their alibis and found solid evidence proving they had been in other locations at the time. Detectives soon uncovered a troubling detail that made them even more suspicious of the third driver. Remember how he told Celine she could catch an evening bus to her cousin's town from Salisbury? Well, it turned out that no such bus existed. Investigators wasted no time getting the word out about Celine's disappearance. They shared her story, along with the suspect's composite sketch, through newspapers and TV. The case quickly grabbed national attention in both Britain and France. It was just days before Christmas, and the disappearance of a young woman during the holiday season struck a chord with the public. On top of that, there were fears that Celine might have fallen victim to a serial killer. Over the past 2 years, several young women had been murdered in the same area. Police believed these cases were linked to a single perpetrator, and now they were worried Celine's disappearance could be connected to him. As a result, the local police launched a full-scale search. Over 100 officers were assigned to the case, along with helicopters and even an airplane to scan the area from above. They concentrated their efforts along the route the third driver was believed to have taken with Celine. But despite all their efforts, they found no trace of her. Unfortunately, the first week of the search yielded no results. Both the police and Celine's family made numerous public appeals, urging anyone who might know something about her whereabouts or the driver himself to come forward. But every lead they followed quickly turned into a dead end. This went on for over a week, until the morning of December 29th, when police received a chilling call. A man driving near the town of Worcester had pulled over to adjust his windshield wipers. While walking along the roadside, he noticed something odd partially covered by snow. Curious, he went closer and, to his horror, realized it was a human body. Shaken, he immediately rushed home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman, but at first, they couldn't identify her. Initially, they thought it might be the remains of a local woman who had disappeared after leaving a nightclub, but the theory was quickly ruled out. It wasn't until the following day, December 30th, that police confirmed the body was Celine's. Her cousin was brought in to identify her, sparing her parents the heartbreaking task of doing it themselves. Police quickly noticed one important detail. The highway where Celine's body was found was almost in the opposite direction of where she had been heading. This only strengthened their theory that the truck driver who had given her a ride was likely responsible for her murder. All of Celine's clothing and personal belongings were missing, and officers found no trace of them near the site where her body was discovered. The autopsy revealed multiple bruises and abrasions consistent with heavy blows, as well as evidence of strangulation. Medical examiners also found signs of SA on Celine's body, but there was no biological material that could lead them to the perpetrator. One chilling detail stood out. The examiners determined that Celine's body had likely been left by the roadside only about 24 hours before it was found. With 11 days having passed since her disappearance, detectives speculated that the killer may have kept her alive for most of that time or even transported her body with him. The second driver who had helped Celine mentioned that the suspect's truck was equipped with an industrial freezer, which suggested the killer could have preserved her body at low temperatures for days. Despite all this, the police still had no solid leads on the driver's identity. However, a conversation with Celine's parents revealed an intriguing detail. She had been carrying 2 bottles of champagne as Christmas gifts. These, along with all her other belongings, were never found. It seemed likely that the killer had taken them, which gave investigators a potential new angle to explore. This champagne was a specific French brand that wasn't sold in Britain, making those two bottles completely unique in the country. Police decided to use this as leverage and sent information about the bottles to the media, along with photos of identical champagne. They hoped that the perpetrator might have shown them to someone or even shared them with friends or family. But unfortunately, this lead also went nowhere. Without any other leads in hand, investigators decided to take an unprecedented step. Despite the absence of the perpetrator's DNA on the victim's body, in early January of the following year, they initiated the first mass DNA collection in Britain's history. The police focused their efforts on drivers of Mercedes trucks and similar models. This process took over a month, and detectives managed to test more than 5,000 drivers. Most of them willingly provided their samples, but there were some who refused. Investigators put them on a separate list for further scrutiny, thinking that one of those individuals might be the killer. Meanwhile, Celine's case continued to gain widespread attention in both British and French media. The police received thousands of tips and leads, but unfortunately, none of them brought the detectives any closer to catching the killer. This continued until mid-February, when one tip finally caught the investigators' attention. A man called the police after seeing the suspect's sketch on the news and said it looked strikingly similar to one of his co-workers, a 36-year-old truck driver named Stuart Little. He also mentioned that Stuart drove a Mercedes truck with a refrigeration unit. This lead prompted detectives to start digging into Stuart's background. The first thing they uncovered was Stuart's extensive criminal history, though it consisted of non-violent offenses. Next, they decided to approach him carefully and ask for a DNA sample, presenting it as a routine part of their investigation involving thousands of drivers across Britain. However, Stuart refused to provide a sample, which only deepened their suspicions. After several more attempts to persuade him, though, Stuart eventually gave in and agreed to the test. As soon as they had his DNA, the police secured a warrant to search his truck. That's when they found their first major evidence: traces of blood on the mattress in the sleeping area and in other parts of the cab. Testing confirmed it was Celine's blood, and that was enough for an arrest. The police also obtained a warrant to search Stuart's house. In his garage, they discovered Celine's personal belongings, the ones she had with her when she disappeared. But that wasn't all. Investigators noticed something odd about Stuart's tachograph, the device truck drivers are required to use by law to track their driving hours. It appeared that on the day Celine's body was dumped, Stuart had deliberately concealed information about his movements. However, he made a mistake. After disposing of the body, he resumed work without filling in the missing data. This created a suspicious gap in his driving log, which detectives believed corresponded to the time he transported Celine's body to the roadside. During his first interrogation, Stuart denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he had never even picked up Celine. But when police brought in the other driver, who identified Stuart in a lineup, his story changed. He now admitted to giving Celine a ride and claimed they had consensual intercourse. As for her belongings found in his garage, Stuart insisted she had simply forgotten them when he dropped her off. Naturally, investigators weren't quick to believe Stuart's story. They continued searching for evidence and soon found a witness who had seen him the day before Celine's body was discovered. The witness spotted Stuart near a warehouse about 50 miles from where the body was found. He was seen starting a fire next to his truck, and it appeared he was burning something. When police confronted Stuart about this, he claimed he'd started the fire to warm up his truck brakes, which had supposedly frozen due to the weather. Officers decided to search the area near the warehouse, and it didn't take long for them to find something disturbing. Underneath a fence, they discovered Celine's underwear. It was stained with her blood. Piecing together all the evidence, investigators came up with the most likely timeline of events. When Stuart picked up Celine, he drove to a secluded area where he assaulted and killed her. Based on the blood evidence found in his truck, they believe Stuart kept her body on the lower bunk in his cab for 10 days while continuing to make deliveries as if nothing had happened. Shockingly, just a week after the murder, Stuart went home to celebrate Christmas with his wife and children, while Celine's body remained just a few yards away in his truck. At some point, he decided to dispose of the body. Investigators found receipts showing Stuart had purchased a shovel, an axe, and a saw, likely with the intention of dismembering her remains. However, for some reason, he abandoned that plan and simply left her body near the roadside. Detectives soon uncovered another chilling detail. The day after Christmas, Stewart gave those 2 bottles of rare French champagne to an acquaintance as a gift. When detectives questioned him about it, Stewart claimed he'd bought the bottles from another French truck driver, but investigators didn't believe a word of it. On top of that, they uncovered another intriguing detail. Stewart had always worn a beard, but he completely shaved it off after the murder. Right around the time the suspect's sketch started appearing in the news. They also figured out why Celine couldn't reach her cousin when she tried to call him from a payphone. It turned out that the UK had recently changed its phone codes, and Celine had his number written down with the old code in her notebook. Unaware of this update, she dialed the outdated number, and her call never went through. For Stewart's family, friends, and co-workers, these revelations were a complete shock. To them, he had always seemed like a devoted family man and a reliable friend. At first, many even refused to believe he could have been involved. But as the media revealed the mounting evidence against him, they had no choice but to face the horrifying truth of who Stewart really was. Stewart's trial began in October of that year, and despite the mountain of evidence against him, he stuck to his story, denying everything. But the jury didn't need long to deliberate. They unanimously found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving at least 20 years. Soon after his sentencing, Stewart tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that the high-profile nature of the case had biased the jury, preventing him from receiving a fair trial. However, the appeals court rejected his claims. In 2006, Stewart made another attempt to have his sentence reviewed, but once again, his appeal was denied. 10 years later, in 2016, Stewart became eligible for parole, but his request was denied. The reason was clear. Even after spending 2 decades in prison, he still refused to admit to the crime and maintained his innocence. The judge also voiced concerns that Stewart remained a danger to society. As of now, Stewart remains behind bars, with little chance of being released anytime soon. It's worth mentioning that Stewart was ultimately ruled out as a suspect in the other murders I mentioned earlier. Those crimes turned out to be the work of another truck driver who was arrested in late 1997. While prosecutors linked him to just 2 murders, they still believe he might be responsible for several other unsolved cases. As for Stewart, investigators also suspected that Celine might not have been his only victim. However, after all these years, no evidence has been found to connect him to any other crimes. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe and press the like button if you enjoyed my video. An 18-year-old girl left work and headed home, but she never made it back. Police launched a massive search right away, but despite all their efforts, the case went nowhere. That was until a chain of shocking twists turned everything upside down, and the truth finally came out. Jennifer Teague was born on June 30th, 1987, in Ottawa, Canada. The youngest of 3 children, she'd always been looked after by her 2 older brothers. After her parents divorced, Jennifer and her mom moved in with her grandmother, while her dad lived close by and stayed an active part of their lives. During her school years, Jennifer threw herself into sports. She played baseball, soccer, and was absolutely obsessed with hockey. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of her favorite players. Around the same time, she discovered a passion for protecting the environment and even joined a group that visited elementary schools to teach kids about the importance of taking care of nature. When she got to high school, Jennifer started picking up part-time jobs to cover her own expenses and put a little aside for the future, even though she still wasn't sure what she wanted to do after graduation. She thought about studying fashion design, but she also considered a career in protecting the environment. In September 2005, when Jennifer was 18, she started her senior year of high school and was already counting down the days to her graduation. She kept working evening shifts at a local Wendy's while juggling school, and around that time she adopted a kitten from a shelter. She couldn't wait for her next paycheck, so she could pay for the kitten's shots. On Wednesday, September 7th, Jennifer came home from school, took a short break, and then headed out to the bus stop to get to the restaurant where she was scheduled for the evening shift. Around midnight, she closed up the restaurant and started walking home. By then, the buses had stopped running, so Jennifer had to walk a little over a mile. Even though it was late, most of her route was along well-lit main streets, so she wasn't too worried about her safety. After all, it was the same walk she made almost every day. After leaving work, Jennifer decided to call two of her friends who were also finishing their evening shifts nearby. They agreed to meet up outside a 24-hour convenience store about halfway between her job and her house. The three of them sat there for about an hour, chatting and sharing stories from their day. At about 1:30 in the morning, Jennifer said goodbye to her friends and started heading home. She had about an 18-minute walk left. The next evening, Jennifer's mom began to worry. She hadn't heard from her daughter since the night before. Jennifer's room was in the basement, so when she came home late from work, no one in the family ever saw her. In the mornings, she usually left early to catch the school bus before her mom and brothers were awake, so they wouldn't see her then either. But when Jennifer didn't come back from school and didn't answer her mom's calls, the worry turned into real fear. Jennifer always let her know if she was going somewhere, but that day, there was nothing. Soon her mom learned that Jennifer hadn't shown up to school at all, and later she missed her shift at the restaurant too. That's when the panic set in. She called all of Jennifer's friends, but no one had seen her since the night before. Jennifer's dad also said she hadn't contacted him. With no answers, her parents went straight to the police and reported her missing. Even though Jennifer was already 18, local police didn't waste any time and launched a search right away. While officers questioned Jennifer's friends and classmates, her family and neighbors split up to help. Some searched the streets, while others printed and posted flyers with her photo and information about her disappearance. The first thing police considered was that Jennifer was unlikely to have run away on her own. Her family and friends all described her as extremely responsible. Someone who had never disappeared for even a few hours without letting someone know where she was. Next, detectives started piecing together Jennifer's movements that night. They spoke with her friends, who said she headed toward home around 1:30 in the morning while they walked off in the other direction. But investigators soon uncovered something interesting. Jennifer hadn't left work alone. A coworker named Mark had walked with her for part of the way before she split off toward the convenience store where her friends were waiting. When detectives went to talk to Mark, they immediately noticed several fresh scratches on his face, something that looked suspicious right away. He insisted he'd cut himself while shaving and even showed them his razor, though of course that didn't prove anything. Detectives began to wonder if Mark might have had something to do with Jennifer's disappearance and whether those scratches were left behind as she tried to fight him off. Still, there was no real evidence to link him to a crime, so they asked him to take a polygraph test. Mark agreed, and the examiner found no signs of deception. That result made investigators begin to doubt his involvement. Detectives also looked into Jennifer's ex-boyfriend. He told them that he and Jennifer were still on friendly terms, but that he hadn't spoken to her that night and had been home the entire time. He, too, agreed to take a polygraph test, and when the results showed no signs of deception, investigators crossed him off their list of suspects. Soon after, police turned their attention to another possible suspect, a 21-year-old local named Boris. According to Jennifer's friends, he knew her, and they'd even seen him drive past while they were sitting outside the store that night. Digging deeper, detectives learned that Boris had a troubling reputation. He was known for odd behavior and in the past had even been accused of stalking women with a restraining order issued against him. People who knew him often described him as paranoid. Jennifer's friends also revealed that shortly before she vanished, Boris had asked her out, and she had turned him down. Armed with this information, detectives went to speak with him. Boris denied having anything to do with Jennifer's disappearance, but he was noticeably nervous and struggled to answer some of their questions. Still, he allowed them to search his car without a warrant. Right away, investigators noticed that one of the windows was shattered. They considered the possibility that it had happened during an abduction, but Boris insisted it had been broken on a different day. He also agreed to a polygraph test, and the examiner reported no signs of lying in his responses. So despite his odd behavior and concerning past, detectives found nothing concrete linking Boris to Jennifer's disappearance. Officers, along with Jennifer's family and friends, kept searching all over the city, but they couldn't find Jennifer or any trace of her belongings. Meanwhile, a new theory started spreading through Ottawa. Some believed a serial killer might be behind her disappearance. Just 2 years earlier, a woman named Ardith would had vanished on the other side of the city, and days later her body was discovered in a river. Police had never caught the person responsible, and now people feared that the same predator could be connected to Jennifer's case. With no solid leads, investigators poured everything they had into the search. They set up a command center inside a church near the convenience store where Jennifer was last seen. Hundreds of locals came to help, splitting into groups to comb through different parts of the city. Police brought in search dogs and even used helicopters equipped with heat sensors. Detectives also went door to door, checking every house along Jennifer's route home. Before long, they got a potential lead. A woman, who lived on the edge of Jennifer's neighborhood, reported hearing a piercing scream around 1:30 that night. She looked out her window, which faced the main road, but didn't see anything suspicious and chose not to call the police at that time. Now, however, detectives believe that scream may have been Jennifer's. Given the timing and location, it could very well have been the moment she was abducted. Not long after, another neighbor came forward saying he too had heard the scream that night, but like the first witness, he hadn't seen anything that could point investigators toward a suspect. A week went by with no sign of Jennifer and not a single real lead, and hope of finding her alive was fading fast. That's when detectives officially reclassified the case as a possible homicide, giving them access to even more resources. They held a press conference asking anyone in the city with information to come forward. Jennifer's parents also spoke directly to her presumed captors, pleading with them to let their daughter go. But in the days that followed, the search kept coming up empty. So investigators tried a different approach. Jennifer's neighborhood was mostly made up of private homes with their own yards, and technically, police would have needed a search warrant to search each one. No judge was ever going to sign off on hundreds of properties. So instead, detectives went door to door asking for voluntary permission. Almost everyone agreed, and officers combed through hundreds of yards and houses. But even then, they didn't turn up a single clue. That went on for several more days until everything suddenly changed. On September 18th, a week and a half after Jennifer disappeared, an off-duty officer took his family to a park on the edge of the city. As they walked along a trail, he caught a familiar smell of decomposition and followed it into the woods. Just a few dozen feet from the path, he spotted a human body, partly covered with branches and leaves, and immediately called it in. The remains were turned over to medical examiners, since the body was far too decomposed to be identified visually. All of the clothing was missing as well. Investigators suspected it might be Jennifer, so the lead detective made a calculated move. He instructed his team to set up a police tent near the parking lot at the beginning of the trail, so the press wouldn't discover the real location. The idea was simple. Only the killer would know the real spot where the body was hidden. Not long after, medical examiners confirmed the remains were indeed Jennifer's. But because of the level of decomposition, they couldn't determine an exact cause of death. Her body was sent to a lab in Toronto for further analysis, but the results were the same. Still, one thing was absolutely clear. This was no accident. It was murder. After Jennifer's body was found, police once again turned to the public for help. This time, they released several dozen surveillance images taken inside the convenience store where Jennifer had spent time with her friends on the night she vanished. Detectives believed her abductor might have been in the store, spotted her there, and then waited for the right moment to follow her home and attack. Investigators worked to identify every person who appeared on the footage, but a handful of men still remained unknown. Around the same time, another possible lead surfaced. After news of the body broke, a witness came forward saying he'd walked through the same park early in the morning on September 8th. He recalled seeing a man standing near the entrance of the trail, and he'd gotten a clear enough look at his face to help police put together a composite sketch. Detectives believed this man was very likely Jennifer's killer, and they hoped someone in the community would recognize him. The problem was, the sketch came out vague, lacking detail, and it could have resembled a lot of different people. That triggered a new flood of tips, but every lead ended in a dead end. To make matters even more frustrating, two separate people actually confessed to killing Jennifer. After a careful investigation, police determined both men were lying. Neither had the opportunity to commit the crime. They just wanted the attention. From that point on, the case basically stalled. Tips were coming in less and less often, and police still had no evidence that could bring them any closer to solving Jennifer's murder. Sometime later, investigators got word from their colleagues that the case of Ardith Wood, the woman killed 2 years earlier, had finally been solved. The killer turned out to be a local man, and detectives immediately looked into whether he could also be responsible for Jennifer's death. But it didn't take long to confirm that he hadn't even been in the city at the time of her abduction. So any possible connection between the two crimes was ruled out. By early 2006, detectives made a few more pushes to get answers, once again appealing to the public for help. But none of it led anywhere. That's how things stood until June 9th, when detectives got a completely unexpected call. Staff at a local hospital reached out with a bizarre story. A man had run into the street completely naked, screaming, "I killed Jennifer Teague." Police rushed to the hospital, and when they questioned him, he actually admitted that he was the one responsible. But there was one major problem. Tests showed the man had taken 5 times the normal dose of hallucinogenic mushrooms. Once he sobered up, he told investigators he didn't remember anything about making that confession and had no idea why he said it. According to him, he had nothing to do with Jennifer's murder. He only knew about it from the news. He claimed that on the night Jennifer vanished, he had been at a friend's house playing video games. But there was a catch. When detectives went to question the friend, they discovered he'd recently been in a serious accident that left him with partial memory loss. He couldn't recall what happened that night, or even who he'd been with. Still, detectives couldn't ignore the situation and decided to dig deeper. 24-year-old Kevin Davis had no criminal record and worked at a local pizzeria. What stood out most, though, was where he lived, directly across the street from the woman who had reported hearing a scream, and only a few dozen feet from the church where police had set up their command center. As detectives pieced everything together, they stumbled across something striking. It turned out they had already spoken with Kevin in the very first days after Jennifer disappeared. Since he lived in the neighborhood, officers had knocked on his door with their standard questions. Back then, Kevin told them he'd been home all night, and his mother, who was sleeping in the next room, backed up his story. But now, almost a year later, he was claiming he'd actually been at a friend's place playing video games. And that wasn't the only red flag. Reviewing the case files, detectives found a tip that had come in right after Jennifer's body was discovered. Someone had suggested they take a closer look at Kevin because he resembled the composite sketch. At the time, investigators dismissed it as just one of hundreds of leads with nothing concrete to back it up. But now, with his drug-fueled confession combined with all these inconsistencies, Kevin suddenly looked much more suspicious. Still, there was one big problem. There wasn't a single solid piece of evidence against him. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing tying him directly to Jennifer's murder. And Kevin wasn't confessing anymore. With the case hanging in limbo, detectives began wondering how they could ever hold him accountable. For the next few weeks, detectives kept digging, revisiting files, brainstorming new angles, searching for anything they might have missed. But nothing came together. Eventually, they started to fear that Kevin would never be arrested, that he'd slip away and remain free. But then, out of nowhere, everything changed, and in the most unexpected way. On June 26th, just a few weeks after being released from the hospital, Kevin walked up to his neighbor and said he needed help. When the neighbor asked what was wrong, Kevin told him to call the police because he had killed Jennifer Teague. After that, Kevin went to a nearby store where he came across a police officer. He calmly approached him and repeated the same thing. He had murdered Jennifer. He was taken straight to the station, and this time, detectives made sure to cover every detail so that Kevin couldn't walk back his confession later. They read him his rights, then brought in medical staff to test his blood for drugs or alcohol. The results came back clean. Only then did they turn on the camera and begin recording as Kevin gave his confession. Kevin told detectives that he carried a deep hatred toward women for most of his life because they never loved him. In the days leading up to Jennifer's murder, he started going out at night, taking his mother's car and driving around with a knife, rope, and a gag. He admitted he was hunting for a vulnerable victim, guided by two simple criteria. She had to be young and she had to be defenseless. His original plan was to abduct someone, bring her back to his house, and sexually assault her. He also said he finally made the decision to act after two personal blows, losing his job and the death of his beloved pet. On the night Jennifer disappeared, Kevin parked near the convenience store and spotted three girls sitting outside, laughing and talking. He stayed back out of sight of the cameras and waited for them to split up. Sitting in his car, he thought through how he'd carry out the abduction. Around 1:30 a.m., Jennifer said goodbye to her friends and walked down the road toward her neighborhood. Even though the street was mostly well lit, there were stretches of darkness, and Kevin attacked her in one of those spots. He forced her into his car at knife point and drove her to his house. Since he lived with his mother, who was asleep in the next room, he had to stay quiet. Using the knife to threaten Jennifer into silence, he led her to his bedroom and tried to sexually assault her, but he couldn't make it. Enraged, Kevin strangled her to death, and his mother, sleeping just on the other side of the wall, heard nothing. After getting his confession, detectives asked Kevin to show them where he had left Jennifer's body. He pointed them straight to the real location, not the decoy site where police had set up a fake tent for the press, but the actual spot that only investigators knew about. That detail alone confirmed he was telling the truth. Finally, Kevin explained why he had decided to confess, and his answers stunned the detectives. He said that after officers showed up at his house a few weeks earlier, he became terrified, convinced he was about to be arrested. His paranoia spiraled out of control. He truly believed police were watching him at all times. At work, he even demanded that a coworker lift his shirt so he could check for a hidden wire. Living in constant fear, he decided the only way to end his torment was to come clean, completely unaware that, in reality, detectives had no evidence at all. If he had kept quiet, he might have escaped justice entirely. In the end, Kevin was charged with murder and sent to jail to await trial. From behind bars, he tried to take back his confession, but this time he had no chance. The trial began in January 2008, and once again, Kevin chose to plead guilty. That decision made the proceedings move quickly, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after at least 25 years. In his final statement, Kevin claimed he regretted what he had done and said he would gladly give his own life if it could bring Jennifer back. But Jennifer's father, who sat in the courtroom that day, later admitted he didn't believe a word of it. To him, Kevin's so-called remorse sounded more like a calculated attempt to soften his sentence than anything genuine. In the end, Kevin was sent off to serve his time, with no guarantee he'll ever be released once those 25 years are up. And one last note. Back in 2015, Jennifer's father published a book about the case and how their family managed to survive the unthinkable. He explained that his main goal was to help others who've lost loved ones, showing them that no matter how dark it gets, it's still possible to find a way through the pain. Share your thoughts in the comment section and don't forget to press the like button if you appreciate my video. A young family moved into a quiet, peaceful apartment complex, thinking they found the perfect home. But just days later, their lives turned into a nightmare. What happened shocked the entire country, and though the case was solved pretty quickly, its impact still echoes to this day, sparking important changes in the law. Michael Bush was born on February 13, 1997, in the Canadian province of Alberta. She grew up there with her parents and a younger sister, who was not only incredibly close to her, but also saw her as a role model throughout their lives. Mikhail was a cheerful, energetic, and kind girl, which naturally drew people to her and earned her many friends. One of her biggest passions in life was ice skating. From a young age, she and her parents would often visit local rinks, and over time, it became something she truly loved. While in high school, Mikhail met a boy named Cody, and the two began dating. It didn't take long for them to realize they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. So, after graduation, they started planning their future as a couple. After finishing school, Mikhail got a job at a charity organization that supported people with disabilities. She quickly grew passionate about the work and decided to pursue a career in healthcare so she could continue helping those in need. In 2017, Mikhail enrolled in a local college and earned her nursing degree. After graduating, she returned to her job at the charity center. But shortly after that, something else happened. Mikhail found out she was pregnant. She and Cody were over the moon with joy, and following the happy news, Cody proposed to her in the middle of a rink. In 2020, they welcomed their son, Noah, and began building their life together as a family. Cody worked in pipeline construction, which meant he was constantly traveling across Canada. It was quite tough. His wife and newborn either had to move around with him or spend weeks without seeing him. But in 2021, he got a new job that finally let him stay in one place. With this new job, the family moved to a small town called Hinton. It was a fairly remote area, but for the first time, Cody's work no longer required constant travel, and they could finally settle down and spend more time together. In early September 2021, Mikhail and Cody moved into their new apartment in a residential complex on the outskirts of town. At the time, Mikhail was 24 years old, and their son Noah was just 16 months. The family was thrilled with their new home, surrounded by nature, parks, and a sense of peace and quiet. On September 16th, Cody left for work as usual, while Mikhail stayed home to take care of their son. His shift ended around 6 p.m. and he headed back, looking forward to spending the evening with his family. But to his surprise, neither Mikhail nor Noah was home. Cody checked every room, looked out into the yard, but there was no sign of them. At first, he thought Mikhail might have taken Noah for a walk to one of the nearby parks, but then he noticed something odd. Their son's stroller was still inside the apartment, which meant Mikhail couldn't have gone far with him. Then Cody noticed something even more unsettling. On the kitchen table, there were plates with half-prepared food, as if Mikhail had started making lunch, but suddenly stopped and left the house. Cody started to seriously worry and decided to check the nearby parks and playgrounds, thinking Mikhail and Noah might be there. But after searching everywhere, he couldn't find them and returned home. Hoping for answers, he began calling family and friends, thinking someone might have picked them up. That would have explained why Mikhail hadn't taken the stroller, but no one had seen her that day. On top of that, Cody kept trying to call her, but Mikhail wasn't answering her phone. The whole situation felt increasingly bizarre, and Cody decided it was time to call the police. By the time he made the call, one of his friends had arrived at the apartment complex to help. Together, they searched the area again before the police arrived, but couldn't find them. It seemed like Mikhail had vanished without a trace. The officers arrived shortly after and joined the search. They thoroughly checked the apartment complex, the wooded area behind it, and nearby streets. They also began going door to door, questioning residents in hopes of finding any clues about Mikhail and Noah's whereabouts. Before long, their efforts paid off. One neighbor mentioned seeing a woman who looked like Mikhail running away from the complex toward the road earlier that day. She wasn't screaming or calling for help, and her son wasn't with her. The police decided to follow up on this lead and asked the complex manager for access to the CCTV footage. They reviewed hours of recordings but couldn't find any sign of Mikhail. But then, something completely unexpected caught their attention. Around noon, the same neighbor who claimed to have seen Mikhail was captured on camera carrying 2 large garbage bags out of the building. The police went straight to the dumpster to examine the contents of those bags. When they opened one, they were met with a horrifying sight. Inside was Noah's body, along with some of Mikhail's belongings, including her phone. This discovery immediately changed the course of the investigation. Detectives knew they had to proceed carefully, as Mikhail's whereabouts were still unknown. They suspected the neighbor was directly involved in the crime and decided to search his apartment. But there was a problem. The man lived right next door to Mikhail's apartment, where Cody and other family members were waiting. The 2 apartments shared a wall, and the police were concerned that what they might find inside the neighbor's apartment could trigger an uncontrollable situation. To avoid this scenario, the officers came up with a plan. They asked Cody and his family members to temporarily leave their apartment, explaining that investigators needed to conduct a thorough examination. What they didn't tell Cody was that his son's body had just been discovered only a few dozen yards away. As soon as Cody left, the police went straight to the neighbor's apartment. They requested permission to search the unit, and the man voluntarily agreed. When investigators reached the bathroom, they found Mikhail. Her body was lying in the tub, completely unclothed. After this heartbreaking discovery, the neighbor, 53-year-old Robert Major, was immediately arrested, and detectives now had to piece together what had happened inside that apartment. While waiting for medical examiners to determine the exact causes of death, the police began looking into Robert's background, and what they found was truly shocking. Robert had an extensive criminal record spanning several decades. He had been charged more than 24 times, mostly for sexual offenses. But despite his repeated arrests, Robert had only served short prison sentences. During his time in custody, he was evaluated by multiple psychiatrists, and he openly admitted to them that he really enjoyed committing these acts and took pleasure in his crimes. With multiple expert evaluations on record, authorities knew for sure Robert was likely to reoffend. But instead of keeping him behind bars after his numerous crimes, he was released in 2016. The only measure the police took was to issue a public warning, informing the community about Robert and the threat he posed. Robert was also required to register in a special offender database. He was banned from living near women, children, schools, or playgrounds, prohibited from leaving his city, which was located about 190 miles from Hinton, and ordered to meet with a police representative on a regular basis. But these restrictions quickly became irrelevant. Canadian law basically removed individuals from the registry and lifted their restrictions if they went a year without committing another crime. Because of this, Robert fell off the radar of law enforcement several years before the tragedy. At some point, he moved to Hinton and settled in a residential complex filled with families and children. None of the local police officers were aware of his criminal history. The management of the apartment complex, even if they wanted to, had no way of accessing this information, let alone the residents themselves. Medical experts soon completed their examination of the bodies, while Robert, shortly after his arrest, gave a partial confession, and his words shocked even the most seasoned investigators. On top of that, they managed to gather additional evidence and witness statements that helped piece together the full picture of what happened on that fateful day. That morning, Mikhail and Noah went for a walk in the nearby park. When they returned home, the building manager approached Mikhail to discuss an issue. The problem was that Cody, who worked on pipelines, would often come home with his boots and clothes covered in dirt, leaving muddy tracks all the way to their apartment door. The manager asked Mikhail to address the situation, and she promised to clean it up right away. After their conversation, Mikhail went back inside, put Noah down for a nap, and started preparing lunch. Around this time, she also called a friend. This friend later recalled hearing a knock at Mikhail's door during their conversation, followed by a man's voice. He offered to help clean the hallway, but the friend didn't catch the rest of the exchange. Shortly after, Mikhail returned to the kitchen, finished her call, and sent a message to a family member around 2 p.m. From there, one critical question remained unanswered for investigators. How did Mikhail end up in Robert's apartment? Robert himself refused to clarify this particular moment, leaving police to speculate. Perhaps he lured her there under some pretense, maybe by continuing the conversation about cleaning the hallway or asking for her help with something else. One way or another, Mikhail ended up inside Robert's apartment, and this is where his confession began. Almost immediately after she walked through the door, he attacked her and tried to strangle her, but for nearly 10 minutes he struggled to succeed. In the end, he managed to kill her and then essay her. He then dragged her body to the bathroom before heading to her apartment, where he took Noah and ended his life as well. After committing these horrific acts, Robert placed Noah's body, along with Mikhail's clothes and belongings, into garbage bags and dumped them in a container outside the building. It seemed he had no further plan, as Mikhail's body was simply left in the bathroom. Although he tried to mislead investigators by claiming that Mikhail had run off from the complex, possibly hoping that police wouldn't think to look inside his apartment. As for his motives, they remain unclear. The details of the case, including the full account of his confession, were never made fully public. Investigators shared only bits of information with media, leaving room for speculation. The reason behind Mikhail's murder was relatively straightforward. Not only did Robert find satisfaction in causing harm, but he also killed her with the intent of SA. However, Noah's murder was more perplexing. Investigators suggested that Robert may have killed him out of fear that Noah could identify him. Another theory is that Noah woke up and started crying, which may have scared Robert, thinking the noise could draw attention from the neighbors. One way or another, Robert's main motive became crystal clear through his numerous conversations with psychiatrists. He simply took genuine pleasure in harming others, especially those who were physically weaker than him. It's worth noting that even prison didn't stop him. During one of his previous sentences, Robert assaulted a cellmate, which led to additional charges. With news of this case spread across the country, many were horrified, not only by the brutality of the crime, but also by the fact that such a dangerous man had been allowed to live freely. Public outrage grew even stronger when details of what happened during the trial came to light, but more on that later. Robert openly admitted to psychiatrists that he enjoyed committing such crimes, and all of them agreed there was a very high likelihood he would do it again. But despite this, he was released back into society, and eventually, authorities stopped monitoring him altogether. The residents of that complex had no way of knowing about his criminal past either. Even if he had remained on a sex offender registry, the system in Canada works very differently than in the US. In Canada, only law enforcement officials can access the registry, not the general public. This left many Canadians outraged as the laws prioritized protecting the privacy of a predator but failed to protect Mikhail and her son. The family had moved into that complex just 15 days before the tragedy, only to become victims of a man who lived literally next door. This devastating injustice pushed Cody and the rest of the family to fight for change. They became actively involved in drafting a new piece of legislation named in Noah's memory. The main goal of the bill was to ensure that repeat offenders are monitored for their entire lives, not just for a short period after their release. The bill also proposed creating a public registry of these offenders so anyone could easily check if someone with a criminal past was living in their area. As for Robert, he didn't deny his guilt, so the trial moved pretty quickly. But before sentencing, his final statement shocked everyone and once again raised the question of why someone like him was ever released. He openly admitted that he should remain in prison for the rest of his life because even he would fear what he might do if he were ever free again. At the same time, he claimed he still saw himself as a good person, despite everything he had done. In the end, Robert was sentenced to life in prison, but there was a catch. He would still be eligible for parole in 25 years. If he lives that long, he'll be 78 years old, and there's no guarantee he wouldn't still pose a threat to others, even at that age. As for the bill the victim's family is fighting for, progress has been frustratingly slow. Despite years of advocacy, the legislation still hasn't been passed, and it's unclear if it ever will be. A student headed home after a night out with friends, but she never made it. At first, detectives thought that this would be a pretty straightforward case, but what happened next shocked everyone. As disturbing new details came to light, the whole of Australia was outraged, and the public's anger is still very much alive. Audrey Griffin was born in 2005 in Australia. From the time she was a kid, she was all about sports and not just for fun. She trained hard and took it seriously. Over the years, she racked up some impressive achievements, competing in triathlons, playing rugby and water polo, and showing up to tournaments ready to win. She even flew to New Zealand for a major triathlon and finished 23rd in her age group, out of hundreds of athletes. But Audrey wasn't just about competition. She had a big group of friends who loved being around her because she was full of energy, driven, and genuinely kind. After finishing high school, she got into the University of Technology in Sydney to study marine biology. And around that same time, she started thinking about joining the military. She wanted to serve her country and make a difference, and she had her sights set on the Navy. By the time she was finishing her second year, she made the decision to enlist. She was 19 at the time, and before heading off to start her service, she wanted to spend some time with her dad and her grandparents, who lived in a small town called Arena. She also had a bunch of friends there and figured it was the perfect time to say goodbye before starting this big new chapter of her life. On March 21st, 2025, Audrey spent the day with her family and paid a visit to her grandfather, who was in the hospital at the time. The next day, she met up with friends at a bar in a nearby town. They'd organized a going-away party for her since she'd soon be heading off for military service and wouldn't get to see them for a long while. Audrey had a great time, and around 2 a.m., she decided to head home. First, she tried to call a cab, but the app couldn't find a ride. So, she figured she'd start walking towards her dad's place, planning to make it to the main road that connected a few nearby towns and try to flag down a taxi there. Audrey said goodbye to her friends and headed out. About an hour later, they tried texting and calling her to make sure she got home safe, but she didn't answer. They started to worry, but told themselves she probably just made it back and went to bed. The next morning, Audrey's mom woke up and immediately checked her daughter's location using a smartphone app. She was in Sydney at the time, but she knew Audrey had been out late and just wanted to make sure she got home safely. But when she opened the app, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Audrey's phone was still showing as being near a river that ran through town, nowhere near her dad's house. Worried, she called Audrey's dad, who said she never came home that night. He added that Audrey had mentioned she might crash at a friend's place, so they called that friend next, but she hadn't seen her either. Realizing something was wrong, Audrey's friends called the police and headed to the river where her phone was last pinged. They walked along the shoreline and eventually came across her purse and a hair clip. Right around that same time, police officers arrived at the scene, along with Audrey's father. When they spotted her belongings, they kept searching the riverbank. Then, someone noticed something floating in the water, and as they got closer, it became heartbreakingly clear. It was Audrey. Police turned Audrey's body over to the medical examiner, and the initial conclusion was that she had drowned. Investigators believed it must have been some kind of tragic accident. Maybe she slipped and fell into the water in the dark and wasn't able to get out. Given how late it was and the fact that she'd been walking along a mostly deserted stretch of road, the theory seemed plausible to them. But Audrey's family and friends absolutely refused to believe that. Her mother said Audrey hadn't been drinking that night, and the idea that she could drown in a shallow river just didn't make sense. Audrey had been swimming for years, even in the ocean with strong waves, and she never had any problems. And then there were a few more things that didn't sit right with her fingernails and that her jacket had been torn. Despite all of that, police continued to treat Audrey's death as nothing more than a tragic accident. Over the next several days, her parents waited for some kind of update, or at least a sign that detectives were actively working the case. But nothing happened. Her death didn't even make the local news at first, and only a few media picked up the story days later. Audrey's family and friends couldn't just sit around doing nothing. They kept returning to the river, hoping they'd spot something that might help explain what happened. 3 days after her death, a friend of Audrey's mom found her phone, half buried in the mud near a tree. It was just lying there in plain sight. Her parents were furious. The fact that police hadn't even done a thorough search of the area made things feel even worse. After that, Audrey's mom decided to take matters into her own hands. She started visiting every business along the road where Audrey had walked that night. And surprisingly, not a single one of them had been contacted by police, not even for a routine interview. Unfortunately, none of them had any useful information to offer. So once again, Audrey's family was left with nothing. Weeks went by, and all that time, Audrey's family kept pushing the police to take the case seriously. Eventually, detectives agreed to open a full investigation, and on April 17th, almost a month after Audrey's death, something unexpected happened. Police put out a public request for help identifying a man who had been spotted on surveillance footage along Audrey's route that night. They clarified that he wasn't a suspect, at least not officially. but they wanted to speak with him as part of the investigation. The only problem was the footage was grainy and the man's face wasn't clearly visible, which made it hard to figure out who he was. For the next few days, there were no major updates from law enforcement. But that all changed on April 21st, when detectives suddenly announced they had made an arrest in connection with Audrey's case. They arrested a 53-year-old man named Adrian Torrens, who was found in Sydney, and that same day he was officially charged with Audrey's murder. Once the arrest was made, police shared with the public what they had uncovered over the past few days. At first, they were leaning toward the idea that Audrey's death had been a tragic accident. But after mounting pressure from her family, detectives launched a deeper investigation. By reviewing CCTV footage along Audrey's route, they spotted a man walking several hundred yards behind her. Later, he appeared on another camera, still trailing her. Then, they spoke with a local resident who lived near the river. Around 3 a.m. that night, he heard a sharp, high-pitched scream that lasted for about a minute. At the time, he thought it might have been a wild fox, since their cries can sound eerily human. But after hearing about Audrey's death on the news and realizing the timing lined up, he began to suspect it might have actually been her. Then, police found another witness, a man who had been out walking his dog in the middle of the night. He said he had passed by some man who gave him a bad feeling. According to the witness, the guy looked really on edge, nervous and twitchy, and just came off as strange overall. When detectives got a description, they realized it matched the same man from the surveillance footage right down to the clothes he was wearing. At that point, the theory that Audrey's death had been an accident started to fall apart. Investigators asked for a more detailed forensic analysis of her body, and that's when things really started to shift. This time, the medical examiner found multiple scratches on Audrey's arms, along with abrasions on her face that could have come from a blow. But the most important discovery was still to come. When they took samples from under her fingernails, they found skin tissue. DNA testing revealed it belonged to a man, and when they ran the sample through the criminal database, they got a hit almost instantly. The DNA matched Adrian Torrens. Based on everything they had at that point, police were now working with a completely different theory. The injuries on Audrey's body, along with Torrens' DNA under her fingernails, strongly suggested that she had fought him off, and that he likely held her underwater until she lost consciousness. But even though the suspect was finally behind bars, Audrey's case was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning to gain national attention, and just a few days later, the entire country was talking about it. That's because after Torrens' arrest, disturbing details about his past came to light, and people across Australia were outraged. While Audrey's friends and loved ones were still reeling from the arrest, there was one person who wasn't surprised at all: Torrens' ex-wife, Michelle. When reporters reached out to her, Michelle said she'd been living in fear for months because Torrens had repeatedly threatened her life. The two had gotten married in 2020, and at first he seemed like a kind, caring, and positive guy. But that changed quickly. Not long after the wedding, his behavior started to shift. According to Michelle, he would suddenly snap, flying into fits of rage and threatening her out of nowhere. It didn't take much to set him off, and she began to seriously fear that he might hurt her. By early 2024, Michelle realized she couldn't stay in the relationship any longer. That moment came when Torrens, in one of his rages, punched a hole in the wall, just inches from her face. That was the final straw. She left him and went to the police to get a restraining order. It was a full no-contact order, but within just a few weeks, Torrens had already broken it. He called her 34 times and left 24 voicemails, filled with threats, insults, and promises to kill her. He even said he was on his way to her house multiple times. So Michelle was terrified and living in constant fear. She went back to the police and they went to arrest Torrens, but for some reason, they couldn't find him for 5 whole months. And during that time, the messages and threats kept coming. That went on until January 2025, when police finally managed to track Torrens down and arrest him. It was then that Michelle learned something that left her stunned. Torrens had a long criminal history he'd never told her about. He'd been arrested for drunk driving, drug offenses, and a string of other charges. In 2019, he assaulted his girlfriend and was sentenced to 20 months in prison. but ended up just serving 4. After that, he kept racking up charges. Theft, assault, fraud, you name it. And yet, he somehow avoided any real consequences. When he was arrested in January for violating the restraining order, it looked like he might finally do time. But for some reason, the judge decided to go easy on him. Instead of sending him to jail, they gave him what was basically a slap on the wrist, a kind of probation where he was technically supposed to be supervised, but in reality, there were no real restrictions on his freedom. So Torrens walked free, and just 3 months later, he murdered Audrey. Once that information became public, people across the country were furious. They couldn't understand how the court had let a man like that stay out of prison, essentially giving him the chance to kill a 19-year-old girl. And, to make matters worse, it took police nearly a month after Audrey's death to even start treating it as a possible homicide. Audrey's mother later revealed something else. After Torrens was arrested, one of her friends remembered seeing him at the river, at the exact spot where Audrey had died just 5 days after the murder. He was wearing the same clothes seen in the surveillance footage from that night. But even that wasn't the end of it. Audrey's mother also said that police only began investigating after she demanded to see all the CCTV footage from her daughter's route. Only then did detectives decide to review it themselves and realize someone had been following Audrey that night. And when they finally did arrest Torrens, police managed to bungle that too. They sat down with Audrey's parents and told them that Torrens was likely the killer. Audrey's mom asked if he had done something to her daughter, and the detectives responded, "We haven't had a chance to talk to him yet, because he's asleep." As for Torrens, after his arrest, he refused to confess. But police had something close to a confession anyway. Before taking him in, they tapped his phone, and during a call with a friend, Torrens admitted to the murder. He said something inside him had just snapped, and that he had no idea why he did it. So, the prosecution had everything they needed for a conviction, but then the case took one final unexpected turn. Just 3 days after his arrest, Torrens was found unconscious in his jail cell. He was rushed to the hospital but didn't make it. According to early reports, he did it himself. The news hit Audrey's parents like a second tragedy. Not only had they wanted justice, they had also wanted answers. They needed to know why this man took their daughter away from them. But now that answer died with him. Then again, based on what he told his friend, there may have never been a reason at all. Torrens was known to abuse alcohol and drugs, and he may have been completely out of his mind that night. Michelle, his ex-wife, later said he started calling her again that same evening, threatening to kill her. And just like that, the case was effectively closed, though official procedures are still ongoing to this day. Audrey's story sparked widespread outrage across the country, and for good reason. Not only had the system repeatedly allowed a dangerous man to walk free, but police took nearly a month to even begin a proper investigation. The public was also furious because Audrey was the 23rd woman killed in Australia in 2025 alone. And while such tragedies happen with alarming frequency, people were outraged by the government's continued failure to take real action to stop them. Some steps, however, have finally been taken. A resolution named in Audrey's memory was introduced in Parliament calling for stronger measures to prevent similar crimes. The Prime Minister also launched an investigation into the police department that handled Audrey's case, as well as the jail where Torrens died. Memorial events were held across the country, with thousands of people coming together to honor Audrey's life. One of the most powerful moments took place at the river where her body was found. People gathered and waited for a sunset because that was Audrey's favorite time of day.